The room was small, illuminated only by the dim light of late afternoon filtering through the grimy curtains. The intermittent hum of the oxygen concentrator filled the space, a constant reminder of the fragility of the time that remained. Joseph Carter, a Vietnam War veteran, was slumped in his recliner, eyes half closed as if the effort to stay awake was a battle in itself. His body, once strong and imposing, now seemed consumed by old age, reduced to a shadow of the soldier he had once been. On the small table beside him, an aged picture frame held a black and white photo, a young man in uniform, wearing a proud smile, arms around two fellow soldiers. They were all gone now. Only he remained. "Are you comfortable, Dad?" Linda's soft voice broke the silence. She adjusted the blanket over her father's legs with an automatic tenderness, the kind of gesture that had become routine in the past few months. Joseph didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let out a deep sigh, his chest rising and falling unevenly. "I'm just waiting," he murmured. Linda felt a tightness in her chest. She knew what that meant. Her father had always been a man of few words, but lately he seemed to want to speak even less. As if he were saying goodbye little by little, she knelt beside him, took his wrinkled hand in hers, and gave it a gentle squeeze. "You were never just a man waiting, Dad. You have a story. You have a legacy." Joseph let out a low, raspy chuckle. "Legacy? Tell me, who cares about an old soldier dying in a recliner?" Linda swallowed hard. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, that his life had meaning, but she knew empty words wouldn't be enough. Silence settled between them again, interrupted only by the hum of the oxygen machine. Then, suddenly, the phone rang. Linda frowned. Almost no one called Joseph. She picked up the phone and glanced at the caller ID. The number was unfamiliar. "Must be a wrong number," she muttered, about to decline the call, but something inside her hesitated. What if it wasn't? She answered. "Hello?" A male voice responded on the other end, firm yet respectful. "Good evening. I'm trying to reach Mr. Joseph Carter." Linda glanced at her father, who was now watching the scene with curiosity. "Who's calling?" she asked cautiously. There was a pause. Then the reply came, weighted with unexpected significance. "My name is Donald Trump. I wanted to say a few words to your father." Linda froze. Her eyes widened as her heart pounded. Joseph furrowed his brow, confused. "What is it? Who is it?" Linda looked at her father, then at the phone. She took a deep breath, still processing what she had just heard. "Dad, it's the former president. He wants to talk to you." Joseph blinked, as if the name didn't make sense. Then he laughed, shaking his head. "Very funny. What's next? Elvis came back to life?" Still stunned, Linda put the call on speaker. "Mr. Carter." The voice was clear now, and something in the tone made Joseph's skepticism waver. He narrowed his eyes, as if trying to detect a lie in all of this. "Yes, this is Donald Trump. I heard your story, and I want to thank you for your service." The silence that followed was so dense, it seemed to swallow all the air in the room. Joseph felt his heart race in a way it hadn't in a long time. He looked at Linda, then at the phone. This is a prank?" Trump chuckled on the other end, a short but genuine laugh. "No, sir, this is not a prank. I wanted you to know that your country has not forgotten you." Joseph's eyes, once so tired, suddenly seemed more alive, but there was still disbelief in them. How did you hear about me?" There was a pause. "A young soldier shared your story with me. He said you were a hero, and I wanted to hear it from you directly." Joseph swallowed hard. His chest was rising and falling more quickly now, but not from exhaustion. Something different, something he hadn't felt in years. Importance. Linda watched the scene, tears welling in her eyes. For the first time in a long time, she saw something different on her father's face, something that looked like hope. The silence that followed was heavy, almost tangible. Joseph pressed his lips together, trying to absorb what he had just heard. "Someone told my story," he murmured, still in disbelief. On the other end of the line, Trump's voice remained firm yet respectful. "Yes, sir. A young soldier named Ethan Gallagher. He told me you were a respected leader, that you saved lives in Vietnam. He spoke about your sacrifice, about the men who fought beside you. He said you never sought recognition, but he believed you deserved it." The name felt distant in Joseph's mind, like a long-buried memory. Gallagher. He didn't know an Ethan Gallagher, but the last name. Yes, he knew a Gallagher. "Gallagher," he repeated, his voice trembling. "There was a Gallagher in my platoon. Jimmy Gallagher." Trump paused. "Yes, Ethan is his grandson." A chill ran down Joseph's spine. His heart pounded hard in his chest. Jimmy. Jimmy died in my arms. He was only 19. He was a good kid. The memory hit Joseph like a punch to the stomach. He could see it all clearly. The suffocating jungle, the smell of gunpowder, Jimmy's muffled cry as he fell. Joseph had held his friend in his arms, trying desperately to stop the blood that was flowing too fast. "Tell my mum that I tried to make it home." Those were Jimmy's last words. For decades, Joseph had carried that promise like a weight on his shoulders. He had tried to find the young man's family after the war, but never succeeded. And now somehow Jimmy Gallagher's grandson had found him. "Mr. Carter?" Trump's voice pulled Joseph back to the present. He blinked a few times, feeling his eyes well up. Linda squeezed his hand tightly, as if anchoring him to reality. I don't know what to say," Joseph admitted, his voice tight with emotion. Trump took a deep breath before continuing. "I know that too often heroes are forgotten, Mr. Carter, but I want you to know that your story matters. That men like Ethan still look up to veterans like you with pride, that what you did will never be erased." Joseph closed his eyes. For so long he had felt invisible, just an old soldier waiting for death in a recliner. But now he knew that his life had meant something. He took a deep breath, feeling the air fill his fragile lungs, and then, for the first time in years, allowed himself a small smile. "Thank you," he whispered. On the other end of the line, Trump responded firmly, "No, sir, we thank you." And in that moment, Joseph knew that even in the final days of his life, he was still part of something greater. The call ended, but its impact lingered in the air like a distant echo. Linda still held her father's hand, feeling the slight tremor in his fragile joints. Joseph's gaze was distant, but no longer lost in exhaustion or resignation. There was something different in his eyes. "Are you okay, Dad?" she asked cautiously. Joseph took a deep breath before answering. "For so many years I wondered if Jimmy Gallagher had been forgotten. I carried that guilt, Linda. I promised to tell his mother that he tried to make it home, and I failed." She squeezed his hand. "But now you know he wasn't forgotten. His family is still here. His grandson remembers." Joseph nodded slowly. "Yes, and maybe, just maybe, I can finally forgive myself." Linda felt a lump in her throat. Since the diagnosis, she had feared that her father would pass away feeling irrelevant, as if his life had left no mark. But now, there was a different light in his eyes. "Dad, I think you should talk to this young man, Ethan." Joseph looked at her, hesitant. "Does he really want to talk to me?" Linda smiled, picking up the phone. "Let's find out." The next morning, Linda received a contact number through Trump's assistant. When she called Ethan Gallagher, his response was immediate. His voice on the other end was thick with emotion. "He wants to talk to me, really?" Linda looked at her father, who was watching with anticipation. "Yes, Ethan, he does." There was a brief silence before Ethan spoke again. "Tell him I'm catching a flight tonight. I want to meet him in person." The clock read 7:27 p.m. when Linda heard the doorbell ring. Her heart raced. In the bedroom, Joseph adjusted the collar of his faded plaid shirt, as if wanting to look more presentable. He had never been a vain man, but tonight was different. "Do you want me to answer it?" Linda asked. Joseph took a deep breath and nodded. She walked to the door and slowly opened it. On the other side, a young man in his early 20s stood, wearing a military jacket, his expression a mixture of anticipation and respect. Ethan Gallagher. He hesitated, as if unsure how to begin the conversation. In his right hand, he held a yellowed envelope, worn with age. "Is Mr. Carter?" Linda smiled and stepped aside. "He's waiting for you." When Ethan entered the room, his eyes immediately found Joseph. For a moment, he simply stood there, observing, as if trying to see in the man before him the legend he had heard about all his life. Joseph, in turn, studied Ethan carefully. There was something in the young man's eyes that reminded him of Jimmy, the same spark, the same determination. "You're Jimmy's grandson?" Joseph finally asked, breaking the silence. Ethan nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, my grandfather spoke about you often." Joseph furrowed his brow. "He talked about me?" The young man smiled, pulling an envelope from his pocket and extending it toward him. "I wanted to show you this." With trembling hands, Joseph took the envelope and carefully opened it. Inside was an old letter, yellowed with time. As he began to read, his breath caught in his throat. "Mom, if something happens to me, I want you to know that I tried to make it home. Don't worry about me because I'm beside a great man, Sergeant Carter. He keeps us steady even when everything seems lost. He is strong for all of us." The handwritten words, penned decades ago, filled Joseph's eyes with tears. Jimmy didn't blame him. He never had. Joseph pressed the letter against his chest, closing his eyes for a moment. "I failed him, Ethan." The young man knelt beside the chair, shaking his head. "No, sir. My grandfather believed in you. He trusted you with his life, and so do I." Those words hit Joseph hard. For the first time in many years, he felt a weight lift. The guilt, the regret, the pain, all dissolving. He looked at Ethan, and with tremendous effort, raised his hand, placing it on the young man's shoulder. "Thank you, son." Linda, watching closely, let her tears flow freely, and in that moment, Joseph knew he could go in peace. Joseph and Ethan talked for hours. The young soldier listened attentively to the veteran's stories, as if each word were a precious treasure. Joseph, in turn, spoke as he hadn't in years, reminiscing about camaraderie, sacrifices, and the promises made under enemy fire. "I never thought I'd get the chance to speak with someone from Jimmy's family," Joseph admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I always wondered if his mother ever knew how brave he was." Ethan nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. "My great-grandmother kept everything she could from my grandfather. She always said he died a hero and that you were the reason he found the strength to keep going until the very end." Joseph's eyes glistened. For the first time, he didn't just see himself as a survivor. He was part of a legacy that still lived on. "I only did what any man would do," he said, gripping Ethan's hand firmly. The young man shook his head. "You did much more than that. You inspired generations." Linda, standing by the door, felt her heart swell with pride. Her father had always minimized himself, believing he was just an old man waiting for time to run out. But now, standing before a young man who saw him as a true hero, Joseph was so much more. That night, after Ethan left, Linda helped her father to bed. He was exhausted, but a peaceful smile rested on his lips. "Dad," she whispered. Joseph opened his eyes softly. "Yes, sweetheart. You know your story will never be forgotten, don't you?" He smiled, a real smile, full of peace. "Now I do." Linda held his hand until he drifted off to sleep. For the first time in a long time, her father seemed at peace with himself, and in that moment she knew that even after he was gone, his story would live on forever. The days that followed were different. There was a lightness in Joseph's gaze that Linda hadn't seen in years. He was still a tired man, still fighting his final battle against time, but now he carried something he had been missing: peace. Ethan kept in touch, calling whenever he could. He sent photos of his grandfather, images Joseph had never had the chance to see. In one of them, Jimmy Gallagher was smiling, holding a cigarette between his fingers, the mischievous look of a boy who dreamed of making it home. "He was a good kid," Joseph murmured, looking at the photo. "He always talked about his family, said he was going to be a teacher when he got back." Ethan smiled. "My grandmother said he wanted to teach history. I think he always wanted to make sure no one forgot what happened." Joseph nodded slowly. And he did. On the morning of March 18th, Linda entered her father's room and immediately sensed something was different. He was sitting in his recliner, but his chest rose and fell so slowly it was barely noticeable. His face was serene, his mouth slightly parted, and his fingers rested gently on the photo of his platoon. "Dad." She stepped closer, her heart pounding. She touched his cold hand, and in that instant, she knew. Joseph Carter was gone. The tears came before she could stop them, but despite the sorrow, there was a quiet comfort. He had left this world in peace, knowing that his story would not be forgotten. The funeral was simple, but deeply meaningful. Ethan attended, wearing his ceremonial uniform, and delivered an emotional speech. He spoke of Joseph's courage, the legacy he left behind, and how, even in his final days, he had inspired a new generation of soldiers. At the end of the ceremony, Linda placed the photo of his platoon on the casket and whispered, "You made it home, Dad." A week after the funeral, Linda still felt her father's absence in every corner of the house. The silence that had once been suffocating now felt different. It wasn't empty, but filled with memories. She was flipping through old photo albums when her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and saw Ethan's name. "Hey, Ethan," she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. The young man's voice was filled with excitement. "Linda, you won't believe what just happened." She frowned. "What is it?" "President Trump mentioned your father in a public event. He told the story of Sergeant Carter, spoke about his legacy and how heroes like him should never be forgotten. It's all over the news." Linda's heart pounded. "What?" "And there's more," Ethan continued. "I got a call from the Department of Veterans Affairs. They want to name a wing of a military hospital after him, the Sergeant Joseph Carter Memorial. Tears welled in Linda's eyes. Oh my God! She looked over at the empty recliner where her father had spent so many days, believing no one would remember him. He thought he was just an old man waiting for time to run out, she whispered. Ethan smiled on the other end of the line. And now, his name will live forever. Linda took a deep breath, warmth spreading through her chest. Her father was gone, but his story was still being told, and it always would be. Joseph Carter's story reminds us that every life has meaning, and that the sacrifices of those who served must never be forgotten. If this story touched you, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more heartfelt stories like this. Together, let's keep the memories of our heroes alive.